Chapter 1. Crash and Silence. Mark sat in the middle of the crowded bus, hands gripping the metal bar in front of him as it rattled through the icy streets of Millport. The small northeast city was blanketed in a bitter January cold, and even though the heater inside the bus was working overtime, he could still feel the bite of winter through his coat. The city outside was as tired and gray as he felt, with snow crusting the sidewalks and the old brick buildings standing like silent sentinels against the cold wind. Mark glanced around at the other passengers. It was the usual morning crowd, workers, office staff, and a few parents with young children all bundled up and heading into the downtown area. Mark was on his way to the utilities office, where he worked as a grid technician, monitoring the old electrical systems that powered the city. It wasn't glamorous, but in a place like Millport, his knowledge of the grid was essential, especially in the winter when the power lines were prone to failure. The bus lurched as it gained speed, passing the frozen Millport River and the hydroelectric dam that fed power into the grid. Mark's mind wandered to the day's tasks, thinking about the ongoing issues with the dam's aging turbines. He'd need to head out there later to see what could be patched together. Suddenly, the bus hit a patch of ice, and Mark's grip tightened instinctively. The tires screeched as the driver fought for control. The lights inside the bus flickered. Mark frowned, his pulse quickening. Something felt off. Without warning, the bus swerved violently to the right, slamming into the back of a car parked at the side of the street. The sound of crushing metal filled the air as the passengers were thrown forward, heads and bodies colliding. Mark was slammed against the window, his chin cracking against the metal bar as the bus ricocheted off the car and skidded sideways into oncoming traffic. Screaming, everyone smashed into each other, knocking heads and bodies. Taking the old man next to him with him, Mark slammed to the hard metal beneath his feet. His chin bounced on the cold floor as another passenger fell on his back. Groans of pain and curses echoed throughout the lightless, motionless bus. "What the hell was that? Can someone get a light on, please? Why are we stopped?" More curses, gasping. "Someone get a light on in here." A baby's cries invaded everyone's ears. A mother shushed her, but the crying worsened. Breathless and in pain, the drunk man who had landed on Mark rolled off. Tasting blood, Mark rubbed his throbbing chin and grimaced. It felt like he'd knocked a tooth loose. Groping aimlessly, he grabbed for the old man's arm before finding a vertical pole. His gloved hand slipped as he heaved himself up, still not adjusted to the darkness. Someone banged on the door at the front. "Hey, what's going on?" The baby screamed louder. Mouth filling with blood, Mark looked out the window. There was no light on the street, no streetlights, no cars passing by, no glow from the nearby buildings. "My phone isn't working," someone said. "Neither is mine," another voice replied. Mark's chest tightened. Something about this wasn't right. A lighter flicked on. The small flame danced, casting a dim golden hue across the worried faces around him. The teenager holding it raised it high above his head, illuminating the bus. Every eye tracked the flame. Blood twinkled on the forehead of the old man beside Mark. Mark knelt down and gently shook his shoulder. "Hey, you okay?" The old man groaned, his eyes narrowly open, blood trickling down his face. Mark turned back to the crowd. "He needs help. Anyone a doctor?" The crowd fell silent. Mark scanned the faces, hoping for a reply. None came. The baby kept crying. "Aren't you a city worker?" someone asked, eyeing the insignia on Mark's jacket. "Not that kind," Mark muttered. stomach sinking. He grabbed the old man's arm and struggled to lift him. "I need a hand here." After a moment, a burly man in a construction vest and a woman in a business suit stepped forward, helping Mark get the elderly man to his feet. They moved slowly toward the door, Mark trying to figure out their next move. Someone from the back shouted, "Shouldn't we wait for help?" Mark glanced around the bus. The windows were dark, no glow from the street or nearby buildings. He pushed at the door. "We can't wait. We need to get him out of here." A few people came forward to help pry the door open, and the cold winter air rushed into the bus. Mark shuddered as the bitter chill hit his face. He stepped down onto the icy street, signaling for the others to follow. But outside was worse, much worse. The scene before them was apocalyptic. Cars were scattered like broken toys across the road. Some had smashed into buildings, others piled up against each other. Their occupants slumped over steering wheels, unconscious or worse. Steam hissed from crumpled hoods, mixing with the bitter cold air. The bus wasn't the only one that had crashed. Bodies littered the sidewalks. People crawled out of vehicles, dazed, bleeding, crying for help. The buildings loomed overhead, dark and empty, as if the life had been sucked out of the city itself. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He scanned the skyline, and his eyes caught on the clock tower of Town Hall. Its spire was silhouetted against a sky that seemed far too quiet for this kind of destruction. There were no sounds of emergency sirens, no police cars, no fire trucks, just silence. "What happened?" the boy with the lighter asked, his voice trembling. "Is it an earthquake?" "No," Mark whispered, barely able to hear himself over the sound of his own heart. His mind was spinning, putting together the pieces. The city was completely still. Cars, phones, electronics, all dead. No warning, no gradual failure, just instant, complete shutdown. This was no accident. This wasn't some freak incident or a power outage. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. His job at the utilities office had trained him to recognize vulnerabilities in the grid, to understand the fragility of the infrastructure. And there was only one explanation for something of this scale, something that could wipe out every piece of technology in the blink of an eye. His mouth went dry. An EMP. Chapter 2. Survival Instincts. The streets were a battlefield. Overturned cars, injured people screaming for help. The air thick with panic. No sirens, no emergency vehicles. Nothing but the biting wind whipping through the desolate city. Overhead, thick iron clouds pressed down like a weight, darkening an already grim scene. Mark's mind wasn't on the wreckage around him. His thoughts were consumed by one thing: his family. His 13-year-old daughter, Hope, alone at school, terrified and unsure of what was happening. His wife, Sarah, stranded somewhere in the city, out of reach. The urgency of it gnawed at him. But he had to keep his focus sharp. He couldn't afford to let fear control him. Behind him, the frail elderly woman he had been helping moaned in pain. The small group of strangers who had joined him, people with wide, terrified eyes, looked to Mark for guidance. He swallowed his own rising panic and forced himself to think clearly. "There's a hospital not far from here," Mark said, his voice steadier than he felt. He pointed toward a narrow street ahead. "We can make it if we move now." The thuggish-looking man next to him, who had helped carry the old woman, glanced around at the scene. People strewn across the street, bleeding and begging for help. "What about them?" he asked, his tone a mix of frustration and uncertainty. Mark clenched his fists, his stomach turning at the sight of suffering around him. He hated leaving people behind, but there was no time. "We can't help everyone. Someone else will have to," he said, though the words left a bitter taste in his mouth. He turned and led the group down the side street, moving quickly away from the destruction. They navigated narrow alleys and side roads, Mark stopping only briefly to help those who could walk, pointing them toward the hospital. A few people in his group assisted the severely injured, but Mark knew he couldn't stop for long. His family was all that mattered now. By the time they reached St. Matthew's Medical Center, nearly 20 people had joined them, following in desperate hope for help. But as Mark approached the building, his heart sank. The hospital was dark. No lights, no hum of generators. Nothing but cold, lifeless windows and darkened halls. Mark pushed through the hospital doors, and what met him inside was worse than he could have imagined. The scene was one of utter chaos. Nurses and doctors rushed around blindly, trying to tend to patients in the pitch-black corridors. Flashlights flickered in the darkness, but there were no machines, no monitors, nothing functioning. The emergency power had failed completely. "Why aren't the backup generators working?" a nurse shouted, her voice filled with panic as she struggled to help a patient in the dark. "They're dead. Everything's down," another voice called back, equally frantic. "We have nothing." Mark's group surged inside, but the overwhelmed hospital staff looked at them. The building was already filled to capacity, with patients and staff stumbling through the confusion. "We need a doctor," someone from Mark's group shouted, pushing toward the front desk, where a receptionist sat pale and trembling. "We're full," the receptionist cried, her voice cracking under the strain. "There's no power, no equipment. We can't take more patients. You need to go somewhere else." "Somewhere else?" a man from the back yelled. "There's nowhere else." Mark pushed his way through the crowd, stopping in front of the overwhelmed receptionist. "You have to help these people," he said, his voice hard but controlled. "They've walked miles to get here." The receptionist blinked at him, her face drained of color, her hands shaking. "We lost power to the ICU within minutes," she whispered, her voice filled with dread. "People died in seconds. The generators never came on. We're hardly keeping anyone alive right now." Mark's heart sank, gravity of the situation crashing down on him. "Is there nothing you can do?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The receptionist glanced around at the chaos surrounding them, her eyes filling with helplessness. "We're doing everything we can, but we're helpless." Mark clenched his jaw, knowing he couldn't stay here. His family needed him, and this place was falling apart. He turned toward the crowd, seeing the panic in their faces. Climbing onto a nearby chair, he raised his voice above the noise. "Listen up," he shouted. The room quieted, all eyes turning to him. "The staff here is doing everything they can, but they don't have the power or the resources to help everyone. If we want to get through this, we need to stay calm and let the children and elderly be treated first. Let's keep some order, and they'll help us as best they can." The crowd grumbled, some people shaking their heads, but slowly they began to organize themselves, allowing the worst cases to move forward. Mark stepped down from the chair, moving his way back to the elderly woman he had been helping. A nurse was already tending to her, using a flashlight to clean the wound on her head. The man in the worn jacket stood nearby, and a businessman, in a rumpled suit, looking out of place in the chaos, shifted nervously as he watched. "Thank you for staying with me," the elderly woman said, her voice weak but filled with gratitude. "I wouldn't have made it without you." Mark knelt beside her, squeezing her hand gently. "I'm glad you're okay," he said softly. The woman patted his hand with a trembling one of her own. "You've done enough. Go to your family now. They need you." Mark swallowed hard and nodded. "I will." Without another word, Mark turned and headed for the door. As soon as he stepped outside, the icy wind slapped him in the face. But he didn't slow down. He broke into a run, his breath visible in the freezing air as he sprinted across the darkened lawn. Hope, Sarah. He had to find them. The cold would be the deadliest killer. Without power, the heaters would fail, food would spoil, and water would stop running. As the temperature dropped, people would begin to freeze. And once they realized help wasn't coming, desperation and violence would follow. Time was running out. Mark had to move fast. Chapter 3. The clock is ticking. Mark could hear his brother Jimmy's voice echoing in his mind. Every piece of advice about survival, every warning about how fragile society was. Jimmy had been the family's crazy prepper, always going on about how an EMP could bring everything to a halt. Mark had laughed it off, never taking him seriously. But now, as the city crumbled around him, Jimmy's words weighed heavy on him. Mark wished he'd paid more attention. But Jimmy was hundreds of miles away, in his well-stocked cabin, and Mark was on his own. The city streets were a disaster zone. People wandered aimlessly, their faces a mixture of confusion and panic. Lines were already forming outside grocery stores and gas stations, with desperate people trying to stock up on anything they could get their hands on. The power was out, and nothing was working. No phones, no cars, nothing. Mark weaved through the growing crowds, his mind consumed by one thought: finding Sarah. Every step felt heavier than the last, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The cold wind cut through his jacket, chilling him to the bone. But he couldn't stop now. He had to keep moving. The ground shook beneath him, and a loud explosion echoed from behind. Mark turned just in time to see a car, now fully engulfed in flames, twisted around a broken street lamp. People staggered away from the wreck, coughing and covered in ash. He paused for a moment, torn between helping and moving forward. But when he saw others already rushing to help, he turned back to the road. He couldn't afford to stop, not now. Sarah was out there somewhere, and every second counted. Racing against the biting wind, Mark's lungs burned, his breath coming in short, painful bursts. It felt like invisible splinters were lodged in his throat, each breath more ragged than the last. He skidded to a stop between two unfamiliar buildings, leaning forward, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. Without his phone or GPS to guide him, navigating the city was proving harder than he had expected. Everything looked different now, darker, more foreign. He glanced up at the sky, half expecting to see a military jet or some sign that help was on the way. But there was nothing, only thick gray clouds hanging over the city. Mark couldn't help but wonder if the government had a plan for something like this, or if they were as powerless as everyone else. How long would it take for them to act? Mark turned into a narrow alleyway, trying to avoid the chaos on the main streets. He pushed forward, ignoring the burning in his lungs and the biting wind. He needed to move faster, but his legs felt heavy, his pace slowing with each step. Then he saw it. A rusty old bike leaning against the side of a building, half buried under trash and broken boxes. It looked barely functional, but it was his only option. Without thinking, Mark pulled it free, checking the tires. They were low, but still usable. He hopped on, pushing down hard on the pedals as he sped out of the alley and back onto the street. The bike rattled beneath him, the chain clinking with every turn of the pedals, but it was faster than walking. The wind whipped against his face, making his eyes water, but Mark kept going. The city was collapsing around him, and it was only going to get worse. Crossing the bridge over the river, Mark's heart raced. Below, boats floated aimlessly, their motors useless. Some people were trying to push them to shore with long poles, their movements slow and desperate. Mark pushed harder, ignoring the growing ache in his legs. He had to reach Sarah. She was all that mattered now. The bike carried him through the familiar streets, past landmarks he barely registered, as the urgency pressed down on him. He pedaled faster as he neared her office building, a tall glass structure that now stood dark and lifeless. The sense of familiarity felt jarring against the chaos surrounding him. He abandoned the bike outside the building and ran to the entrance. He grabbed the door handle and pulled, but it was locked. The card scanner inside the door was dead, useless without power. He pulled again, this time harder, and the door broke free from its lock. A small victory, but before he could react, he heard someone call his name. "Mark?" He turned to see Roger Stevens, one of Sarah's co-workers, standing nearby with a clipboard in his hand. Roger's face was calm, almost too calm for the situation. "Roger," Mark said, breathless. "Have you seen Sarah, my wife? She should be here." Roger shook his head, a faint smile on his face. "No, I haven't seen her, but I'm sure she's fine. It's just a power outage, Mark. Everything will be back to normal soon." Mark's stomach twisted with frustration. "It's not just a power outage, Roger. This is bigger than that. This is an EMP. The whole city's down." Roger waved him off, still smiling as if Mark were overreacting. "Come on, don't worry. This happens sometimes. The power goes out, people panic. It'll come back on. We need to stay calm." Mark felt his anger rising. "Roger, the entire city is dead. No power, no phones, no transportation. Nothing is working. This isn't something that's going to fix itself in a few hours. Do you understand how serious this is?" Roger's expression barely changed. "You're being dramatic, Mark. People need to stay calm. We've got people here who are scared, and panicking isn't going to help. It's probably just a regional issue. Let the professionals handle it." Mark clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "I don't have time for this. Sarah's out there, and every second I waste explaining this to you is another second she could be in danger. I need to find her." Roger raised his hands, as if trying to calm him down. All right. No need to lose it. I'll help you look, but I'm telling you, this is going to blow over." Mark's eyes narrowed as his frustration boiled over. He didn't have time to deal with Roger's disbelief. "You're wasting my time. If you're not going to take this seriously, I'll find her on my own." Roger shrugged, his calm demeanor infuriating Mark even more. "Suit yourself, but you're overreacting." Mark didn't respond. He turned and pushed past Roger, his heart pounding in his chest. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. He had to find Sarah before things got worse. As he moved deeper into the building, the cold air from outside still clung to him, chilling him to the bone. The city was on the brink of total collapse, and Roger's casual dismissal of the situation only confirmed what Mark had feared. Most people weren't ready for what was coming. If he didn't find Sarah soon, the real danger would begin. The cold, the panic, the violence. The clock was ticking. Chapter 4. The Signal. Rows of sleek, high-end computers, ergonomic chairs, and darkened monitors filled the corporate programmer office. Normally a hive of activity. The room was now silent. The energy drained along with the power. Desks sat abandoned, wires and gadgets strewn across them, lifeless since the EMP hit. Mark stumbled into the office, blood streaking his face, his body aching from the bus crash. His clothes were torn and smeared with dirt and blood, but he forced himself to keep moving, eyes scanning for Sarah. As he rounded the corner, he finally saw her. Sarah was huddled near a desk, standing with a few of her coworkers. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. But the moment she saw Mark, her expression shifted to relief, and then to horror. "Mark!" she cried, running to him. Her hands immediately reached for his face, tracing the cuts and bruises. "What happened? You're bleeding!" Before Mark could answer, Sarah was inspecting him, her fingers shaking as they hovered over the gash on his head. "You look terrible," she whispered, her voice full of concern. "What happened to you?" Mark grabbed her hands, trying to calm her. "I'm okay," he said, though his head throbbed and his body ached. "It was the bus. There was an accident, but I'm fine. We need to go, Sarah. It's getting bad out there." Sarah's eyes filled with worry as she looked him over. "Mark, you're hurt. You need to see someone." "There's no one to see," Mark replied, his voice urgent. "I'll be fine, but we need to move. We need to find hope." At the mention of their daughter, Sarah's face fell. "Hope," she murmured, nodding. "She's still at school. I've been so scared, Mark. What if—" She stopped herself, biting her lip. "We have to get to her." Mark pulled her closer, holding her tightly. "We will, but we need to go now." Beside them, one of Sarah's coworkers, Tom, was hunched over a large radio, sitting on the desk. He twisted the dials, his face tight with concentration as the radio emitted a steady stream of static. Mark noticed the odd device and stepped toward it. "What's that?" Mark asked, his brow furrowed. Tom glanced up briefly, still working the dials. "It's a ham radio," he explained, his voice flat with focus. "A hobby of mine. I keep it at my desk in case of emergencies. Didn't think I'd actually ever need it." Mark blinked in surprise. "It still works?" Tom nodded, not taking his eyes off the radio. "Yeah, it wasn't affected by the EMP. Kept it in a metal filing cabinet. Guess that worked as a makeshift Faraday cage." The radio crackled again, a faint voice breaking through the static. Mark leaned in, trying to catch the words. "Multiple destinations. New York, D.C., widespread, East Coast out." Sarah's grip tightened on Mark's arm as the words sank in. "It's not just here," she whispered. "Mark, they're saying the whole East Coast is out." Mark's stomach dropped. "How many blasts?" he asked, his voice low. Tom twisted another dial, trying to clean up the signal. "I've heard mention of at least 2, maybe more. New York and D.C. were hit. The military chatter I picked up said it's the entire East Coast." Sarah's face went pale. "What does that mean? Are there more coming?" Tom frowned, adjusting the dial again. "They mentioned this might be the first wave, but the signal's weak and I can't get much else." Mark felt his heart race. "We can't stay here. If this is only the beginning, things are going to get a lot worse." Sarah looked around, her anxiety clear. "Mark, we need to get to Hope. She's out there and—" "I know," Mark said, cutting her off gently. "We'll get to her, I promise. But we need to move now." Tom looked between them, his expression conflicted. I'm going to stay here," he said, gesturing to the radio. "See if I can get more information. It's not much, but it's something." Mark nodded. "You're sure?" Tom gave him a tight smile. "Yeah, I've got some supplies here. Water, a first aid kit. I'll be fine. Just get your family out of here while you can." Sarah hesitated, glancing at Tom and the others. "You're really staying?" Tom nodded. "I'll keep listening to the radio. If things change, well, I'll figure something out, but you two need to go get your daughter." Mark gave Tom a grateful nod. "Good luck." With one last look at her coworkers, Sarah grabbed her coat and stood by Mark's side. "Let's go," she said quietly, her voice trembling but firm. Mark wrapped his arm around her as they pushed open the door. The cold air hit them like a wave, and outside the streets were growing more chaotic. People were gathering in groups, shouting, some already beginning to argue. The tension was palpable, and Mark knew it wouldn't take long before things turned violent. "We'll go on foot," Mark said. Chapter 5. Fractured Paths. Mark and Sarah trudged through the eerily quiet streets, the chill of the wind biting at their exposed skin. Mark winced as he wiped the dried blood from his forehead, feeling the dull throb of his injuries from the bus crash. His body was exhausted, but the need to find hope kept him moving. Sarah stayed close to him, her face pale and strained with worry. Her eyes scanned every corner, every alley, as though their daughter might appear at any moment. "I can't believe this is happening," Sarah muttered, more to herself than to him. "Feels like the world stopped." Mark nodded, his jaw tight. "It did, and it's not going to get better anytime soon." They walked in silence for a while, the occasional sound of shattering glass or distant shouting reminding them of the city's growing chaos. Mark's mind raced as he considered what was happening. An EMP that large meant that everything was out. Power, communication, transportation. Not just in their city, but likely across the entire East Coast. The implications were terrifying, and it was hard to focus on anything other than getting to hope. Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. "I keep thinking about how much money we've probably lost. Everything in the market, our savings. It's all gone, isn't it?" Mark sighed. He'd been trying not to think about it, but the truth was impossible to ignore. "Yeah, probably. If this hit the whole East Coast, the stock market's done. Insurance companies will be drowning in claims, but none of that matters right now." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "Of course, money won't mean anything soon. It'll all be about survival." Mark glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "Are you okay?" She looked over at him, her eyes glassy. "I don't know. I keep trying to focus on hope, but everything feels like it's spinning out of control. What if we can't find her, Mark? What if she's—" "Don't," Mark said, his voice firmer than he intended. "We're going to find her. She's with Becca, and they're probably just waiting at the school, wondering why we haven't come sooner." Sarah nodded, but Mark could see the doubt flickering in her eyes. The same doubt gnawing at him. He reached out and squeezed her hand, trying to reassure her, and himself. "We'll get her," he repeated softly. "We have to." They continued walking, the wind picking up, making the temperature drop even further. Mark looked up at the dark clouds gathering above them. "Looks like snow," he muttered. Sarah glanced at the sky and shivered. "Great, that's exactly what we need. A snowstorm on top of everything." "Yeah," Mark agreed, as if things weren't bad enough already. As they approached St. Francis Academy, the private school where Hope attended, Mark's stomach tightened. The building loomed ahead of them, dark and foreboding under the ominous sky. Normally, the sight of the familiar school would have been comforting, but now it only filled him with dread. What if Hope wasn't there? They reached the front door and tried the handle, but it was locked. Mark pounded on the heavy wooden door, the sound echoing in the empty streets. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "Someone's got to be here." After a tense few moments, The door creaked open a crack, and a tall, thin man appeared. He had graying hair and wore a threadbare sweater, his face lined with stress. Mark recognized him as Mr. Harlan, one of Hope's teachers. "Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell?" Mr. Harlan asked, his eyes darting nervously from them to the street behind them. "Yes," Sarah said urgently. "Is Hope here?" "She's our daughter, Hope Caldwell. She rides to school with Becca Miller." Mr. Harlan frowned, his expression troubled. "I don't recall seeing her today, but I can check. Give me a moment." Mark nodded, his heart racing as Mr. Harlan closed the door. What if Hope wasn't at the school? What if she hadn't made it in time before the EMP hit? The thought gnawed at him, but he pushed it away. They had to stay focused. Sarah stood next to him, her arms wrapped around herself, shivering from the cold and worry. "She has to be here, right?" she asked softly, her voice filled with doubt. "She'll be here," Mark said, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it for her benefit or his own. Minutes passed, and the tension between them grew. Mark paced back and forth, his hands clenched into fists. Why was it taking so long? Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the door creaked open again, and Mr. Harlan reappeared, looking even more worried than before. "I'm sorry," he said slowly, "but Hope isn't here. I checked the records. We don't have her signed in today." Mark's stomach dropped. "What about Becca?" he asked, his voice strained. "She's supposed to be with Becca Miller." Mr. Harlan shook his head. "Becca isn't here either. I checked with the other students, but no one's seen either of them." Sarah's face went pale, and she took a step forward. "That can't be right. They should have been here. Are you sure?" "I've checked," Mr. Harlan replied, his voice apologetic. "I wish I had better news, but they didn't make it to school today." Mark felt a surge of panic. His heart raced, and his thoughts spun out of control. "So where are they?" he demanded. "They didn't just disappear." Mr. Harlan sighed, glancing nervously at the street again. "It's possible they turned back when the power went out. Maybe they're on their way home, or they found somewhere safe." Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke. "We have to find her. She's out there somewhere, and we're standing here." Mark placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to steady her. "We'll find her," he said, his voice firm. "We'll look until we do." Mr. Harlan sighed again, looking genuinely sorry. "I wish I could be more help. We're trying to keep the school locked down for the safety of the students inside. I can't let you in right now." "I understand," Mark said, though frustration simmered beneath his calm exterior. "Thank you for checking." Mr. Harlan gave them a curt nod before stepping back into the school and closing the door. The heavy thud echoed once again, leaving Mark and Sarah standing alone on the cold steps. Sarah's shoulders slumped, and Mark could see the tears brimming in her eyes. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice small and trembling. Mark clenched his jaw, his mind racing. They didn't have a choice. Hope wasn't at the school, which meant she was out there somewhere, maybe trying to get home, maybe looking for them. But they couldn't stand still. "We look for her," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We check everywhere she might have gone. Maybe Becca drove her somewhere else when everything went down." Sarah nodded, wiping at her eyes, though the worry never left her face. "Okay," she whispered. "We have to find her, Mark." "We will," Mark promised, though the knot of fear in his stomach refused to loosen. They turned away from the school and made their way back down the steps, stepping into the cold, dark streets once again. The wind had picked up, howling through the narrow alleyways and chewing at their skin. The distant sound of shouts reminded Mark that the city was teetering on the edge of collapse. He tightened his grip on Sarah's hand as they started walking again, their pace quickening despite the cold and fatigue setting in. Every step they took felt heavier, the tension growing with every passing minute. Mark glanced over at Sarah, seeing the fear and determination in her eyes. They couldn't stop. They had to find hope before things spiraled out of control. "We'll start at Becca's house," he said, trying to formulate a plan. "And if they're not there, we'll figure out the next step. But we're not stopping until we find her." Sarah nodded, her voice steady. "Let's go." Chapter 6. The Long Road Ahead. Mark's thoughts drifted to the first time he and Sarah brought Hope home from the hospital. The memory felt like a lifetime ago, yet it was so clear in his mind. They'd been nervous, fumbled through the motions of new parenthood, but the moment Hope was nestled between them, everything had fallen into place. She was small and pink, wriggling against Sarah's chest. The world outside their apartment had faded, and for a while, it was the three of them. Mark had promised himself that no matter what happened, he would protect her. Now, as he and Sarah hurried through the eerily quiet streets, the promise felt more impossible with every step. The city had become unrecognizable. No sounds of traffic, no bustling sidewalks. Just silence, punctuated by distant shouts and occasional gunshots. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the deserted roads. Sarah's breathing was labored, her face pale with worry. "Do you think we should have stayed at the school longer? Maybe someone would have shown up." Mark shook his head, scanning the empty street ahead of them. "There's no one coming, Sarah. The military, the police, they can't help us now. The EMP knocked out everything, communications, power. They're as crippled as we are." Sarah ran a hand through her hair, her voice trembling. "I just keep thinking, if we had stayed closer to her, maybe we'd know where she went. She was always in her room, online, but we barely even talked these last few weeks." Mark winced at the truth of her words. They'd both seemed consumed by their own lives, work, daily routines. Hope had drifted into her own world, like so many teenagers, and they had let it happen. "I know," he admitted quietly. "We've been so busy, and now she's out there, and we don't even know where." The streets were growing darker, and the wind whipped around them, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke. The sounds of chaos were growing closer, breaking glass, raised voices. Mark quickened his pace, pulling Sarah along with him. "We need to get to Becca's house," he said, his voice firm. "It's a 3-mile run, but it's our best shot. If they went anywhere, it's there." Sarah nodded, her face tight with fear. "But what if they're not there? What if something happened?" Mark's mind raged, but he forced himself to stay calm. "We'll figure it out. We can't stop now, if we don't find her before dark." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what nightfall would bring. More chaos, more danger. The city was already starting to unravel, and once the sun set, there would be nothing to hold it together. As they continued running, the distant sound of gunshots echoed again. Sarah flinched, her hand gripping Mark's arm tightly. They both knew it was only a matter of time before the violence reached their part of the city. The streets were already growing more dangerous, with groups of people forming and looters starting to take advantage of the blackout. "Do you think the military will come eventually?" Sarah asked, her voice a mixture of hope and fear. Mark sighed. "Maybe, but not anytime soon. They're dealing with the same mess across the entire East Coast. We can't rely on them right now." They turned a corner, and the familiar building of their neighborhood came into view. It felt surreal. Just a few days ago, everything had been normal. Now, the darkened windows and empty streets felt like they were walking through a nightmare. Mark glanced at Sarah, his voice softening. "We'll find her. We'll figure this out." Sarah nodded, though the doubt was clear in her eyes. I keep thinking about how much time we've lost. All the times we could have talked to her, really connected with her. And now?" Mark squeezed her hand. "I know, but right now we need to focus. We can't change the past, but we can get her back." They walked in silence for a while, the weight of their words hanging between them. Mark's mind raced with memories, moments of laughter, of family dinners, of Hope's quiet determination as she focused on her schoolwork. He had always been proud of her, always trusted that she would be fine, no matter what. But now, with the world collapsing around them, that trust felt like a fragile thing. They were nearing Becca's neighborhood when the sounds of chaos grew louder. Shouts, the clatter of metal, and more gunfire in the distance. Mark's pulse quickened. They didn't have much time. "I don't understand why they didn't make it to school," Sarah muttered, almost to herself. "If they left on time, they should have been there before everything went dark." Mark ran a hand through his disheveled hair, frustration building in his chest. "It doesn't make sense. If Becca took the usual route, it should have been about 6 miles. Even with traffic, they would have made it by 7:30. The blackout didn't hit until almost 9. "Then where are they?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "I don't know," Mark admitted, the fear gnawing at him. "But we'll find out. We have to." Chapter 7. The Search for Hope. They ran. The chaos of the city was growing worse by the minute, and every step they took brought them closer to finding hope, or so Mark told himself. They had 1 mile left, but it felt like an impossible distance with each passing second. Gunfire cracked in the distance, sharp and unnerving. Sarah flinched at the sound, and Mark's gut twisted with fear. Explosions boomed from somewhere far off, maybe a gas line or something worse. But there was no time to think about it. They had to keep moving. Chestnut Avenue was a disaster. Cars had crashed into storefronts, and people were beginning to lose their patience. A group of men shouted at each other in front of a gas station, their hands gesturing wildly. It wouldn't take much for things to turn violent. "Come on," Mark urged, pulling Sarah along as they veered off into Maplewood Street, trying to avoid the worst of the crowd. The Parkview Hotel stood tall on the corner, its once elegant entrance now a point of chaos. Expensive cars sat dead in the valet lot, and wealthy patrons crowded the entrance, shouting at hotel staff. Police officers stood in front of the building, trying to keep order, but they were overwhelmed. Across the street, a group of homeless men watched the scene unfold, their eyes dark and calculating. Mark and Sarah ran past, their footsteps quick and steady, but the tension in the air was thick. A few shouts from the crowd rose to a crescendo as one man shoved an officer, and the police struggled to contain the onlookers. "They're going to lose control," Sarah muttered, glancing back at the brewing riot. Mark gritted his teeth. "We can't help them. We have to find hope." They pushed on, making their way through the empty streets and past shuttered cafes and shops. They turned onto what used to be Kennedy Park, a place they had taken Hope for picnics and summer afternoons. Now it was deserted, the paths empty, the trees bare, save for a few scattered leaves. The memory of those peaceful days hit Mark like a punch to the gut. But there was no time to dwell on it, not now. Another explosion echoed through the city, this time closer, followed by a crackle of gunfire that made Sarah wince. "We need to hurry," she said, her voice strained but determined. They turned on to Sycamore Street, where old pubs and bars lined both sides of the road. The normally busy area was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of more trouble brewing in the distance. Mark glanced over at Sarah, who was trying to keep pace despite the exhaustion settling into her bones. "We're close," Mark said, trying to reassure her. They'd been running for nearly 50 minutes, and the cold wind was biting at their skin. Sarah wiped the sweat from her brow, her breath coming out in quick, visible puffs in the chilly air. Suddenly, a loud rumbling caught their attention. An old diesel truck, probably from the early 1980s, rattled down the road, its engine roaring as it barreled through the intersection. "I thought nothing worked," Sarah gasped, her eyes wide as the truck disappeared around the corner. "Older diesel engines," Mark said. "They don't rely on electronics, so some of them still run." They pushed forward, turning onto Main Street, only to be met with a grim sight. A large section of the street was blocked off by debris, burnt-out cars, and shattered storefronts, smoke rising from the wreckage. Beyond that, the National Guard had set up a barricade, soldiers standing in formation, rifles at the ready. The crowd had gathered, shouting and demanding answers. Some were pleading for help, others yelling at the soldiers to let them through. It looked like it was only moments away from erupting into something worse. "We need to get through," Mark said, his voice low but firm. "We're so close." They approached the barricade, but a soldier immediately stepped forward, his rifle slung across his chest. "Turn around. No one's getting through here." Mark took a deep breath. "Please, our daughter. She's out there. We need to find her." The soldier's eyes were cold. He shook his head. "I don't care. Get lost." "We're not leaving without her," Sarah cried out, her desperation clear. The soldier's grip on his weapon tightened. "I'm warning you. We will use force if we have to." Mark glanced at Sarah. They had no choice but to turn back, but every step they took away from the barricade felt like a step further from finding hope. The sun was beginning to set, and night was fast approaching. Mark knew they were running out of time. Chapter 8. Shadowed Prey. Sarah leaned against the cold brick wall of the alley, watching the chaos unfold near the barricade. The crowd was growing larger, and the National Guard was struggling to keep order. Shouts and angry voices carried over the walls, blending with the distant sounds of gunfire and explosions. She knew they didn't have much time, and her heart raced as she waited for Mark to return from scouting ahead. Mark had slipped away to find another route around the barricade, leaving her behind to catch her breath. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. They had to find hope before nightfall. The streets were already on edge of exploding into full-blown chaos. Sarah opened her purse, pulling out a piece of gum, her mind elsewhere, focusing on the next step. They needed to figure out how to get around the barricade, avoid the rioting, and reach their daughter before things got worse. A rough hand grabbed her arm, yanking her out of her thoughts. She gasped, twisting around to find a man standing far too close. He had a crazed look in his eyes, his breath quick and shallow. He wore a dirty, oversized coat, and his face was obscured by the shadow of a hood. But what drew Sarah's immediate attention was the gun pressed against her ribs. "Wallet," the man growled, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "Hand it over now." Sarah's heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. Her eyes darted toward the crowd, but there were too many people shouting, too much noise. No one would hear her, and no one would come to help. I don't have much," she stammered. The man jabbed the gun harder into her side, his other hand still gripping her arm. "I don't care. Hand over what you got." Sarah's mind raced as she fumbled with her purse, trying to buy time. She knew if she made a wrong move, this could go from bad to deadly in an instant. Her fingers brushed against her wallet, but before she could pull it out, she saw movement from the corner of her eye. Mark. He was behind the mugger, moving as silently as a shadow. His eyes locked onto hers for a split second, and Sarah swallowed, the panic rising in her throat. The man didn't notice. He was too focused on her. Mark crouched low, picking up a loose brick from the alley floor. He crept closer, the brick gripped tightly in his hand, his knuckles white with tension. "Come on, I don't have all day," the man hissed, leaning closer to Sarah, his gun digging deeper into her ribs. Sarah's pulse raced, her breath shallow as she tried to stall. "Please, I'm getting it. Just don't hurt me." But before the man could respond, Mark struck. With a swift, powerful swing, Mark slammed the brick into the back of the man's head. There was a sickening crack, and the mugger's eyes went wide with shock. He staggered forward, the gun dropping from his hand, clattering onto the pavement. "Run!" Mark shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm as the man crumpled to the ground. But the mugger wasn't done. Groaning in pain, he began to push himself up, blood dripping down the side of his face. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. She just had time to react before another explosion rocked the street nearby. The ground shook beneath them as a massive fireball erupted beyond the alley. Screams filled the air as the crowd surged in all directions, panic spreading like wildfire. The mugger, dazed and bleeding, scrambled to his feet and staggered away, disappearing into the chaos. Mark didn't wait. He grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her with him as they bolted out of the alley and into the street. The explosion had turned the already frenzied crowd into a stampede, people shoving and pushing to get away from the blast. "Come on!" Mark yelled over the noise, his voice barely audible above the chaos. They ran, weaving through the panicked crowd, dodging people as they fled in every direction. The distant gunfire had grown louder, more frequent, and Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before the city descended into complete anarchy. Her legs burned as they pushed forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Mark glanced over his shoulder, his grip tight on her hand as they turned down a narrow side street, trying to put as much distance between them and the explosion as possible. "We need to keep moving," Mark panted, his face tense with determination. Sarah nodded, her mind still reeling from the mugging. Her ribs ached where the gun had been pressed against her. But there was no time to process what had happened. They had to keep going. They had to find hope before it was too late. "Could you find another way around the barricade?" she asked breathlessly. Mark shook his head. "No, but we'll figure something out. We can't go back that way, not now." As they reached the next intersection, the chaos of the explosion behind them faded slightly, but the tension in the air remained. The streets were emptying out as people fled, and the sounds of distant shouting and gunfire echoed through the city like a warning. Mark slowed down, his eyes scanning their surroundings. "We're going to need to find another route. I don't trust the main streets. We'll head to the house first, grab what we need, and then figure out a way to Becca's house." Sarah nodded as they moved off the main street and into the shadowed alleys, their footsteps muffled against the cracked pavement. Chapter 9. Familiar Streets. It wasn't about finding hope. It was about being smart and staying safe. They had to think clearly, to plan, and to stay ahead of the chaos. Hope was resourceful, and if she had any sense, she would have gone somewhere safe. If she wasn't with Becca, he hoped she had somehow made it back home. The familiar streets of Pine Street were now almost unrecognizable. The once bustling neighborhood was eerily quiet, deserted except for the occasional figure moving in the shadows. The tension hung thick in the air, the kind that comes from things truly falling apart. As they approached the house, Sarah unlocked the door, and they stepped inside. For a moment, a sense of relief washed over them, but it quickly vanished. The house was cold and dark, no longer the sanctuary it once was. Sarah instinctively reached for the light switch, but stopped herself just before flicking it. She let out a dry cough and shook her head. Old habits, right? Mark gave her a small nod, understanding the impulse all too well. Yeah, hard to break when it's second nature. He moved through the house, checking the locks and pulling the curtains closed. The eerie stillness only served as a reminder of Hope's absence. A gnawing ache they couldn't shake. "Hope?" Sarah called out. Though they both knew she wasn't there, the emptiness was deafening. Mark checked her room, seeing the same scene they'd left earlier. The bed was neatly made, her books stacked on the desk, and her closet door ajar. He crouched down to look under the bed, knowing it was futile but needed to do something. "She's not here," Sarah said, her voice tight with worry. "I know." Mark stood up, running a hand through his hair, trying to focus on their next move. They gathered in the kitchen, the cold seeping into their bones as the house grew steadily more frigid. Mark opened the fridge out of habit, quickly realizing it was useless now. He grabbed the few remaining bottles of water, setting them on the counter. "We should fill up anything we can while we still have running water," he said, grabbing containers and jugs. Sarah nodded, and they worked fast, filling buckets and bottles with water. The task was mechanical, something to keep their hands busy while their minds raced. As they worked, Sarah's thoughts returned to Hope and Becca. "We need to contact Becca's parents," she said, setting a filled bucket aside. "They might know where the girls are." Mark let out a long sigh, leaning against the counter. "Yeah, that's not happening." Sarah looked at him with a tired expression. "So what now? We can't just sit here." Mark smirked, his attempt to lighten the tension. "I'll give them a call right now," he said, mimicking the motion of pulling out a phone. "Oh, wait." Sarah shook her head, though a soft laugh escaped her. "You're hilarious." Mark's smile faded as he glanced out the window. The light snow had begun to fall steadily, blanketing the streets in a thin layer of white. "We need to get to Becca's house." Sarah shook her head, glancing out the window. "We can't," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "Their place is past the barricade. We're not getting through on foot." Mark's shoulders slumped as he processed her words. The realization that their path was blocked hit hard. "Damn," he muttered. "We don't have time to sit around waiting." "That's our best shot," Sarah agreed, her anxiety rising. "But the city's getting worse by the hour, and we don't know how much time we have before things get completely out of control." Mark turned toward the window, watching the snow continue to fall, blanketing the eerily quiet streets. He knew they couldn't stay idly for long. His mind raced through possible solutions until something clicked. He turned back to Sarah, a spark of an idea forming. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked, looking at him with a mix of hope and skepticism. Mark hesitated for a moment before gesturing toward the garage. "Come with me. I think I have something that might help." Sarah followed him into the cold, cluttered garage. Mark walked over to the far corner, where an old tarp-covered object sat gathering dust. With a swift motion, he pulled the tarp away, revealing a 1969 Chevrolet C10 pickup truck. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "You think this old Chevy will run?" Mark nodded, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "It's a classic, built before all the modern electronics took over." It has a carbureted V8 engine, no computer systems, and EMP wouldn't have fried it. She ran her hand over the faded, rust-speckled hood. But it hasn't been started in years. I've kept it maintained, Mark assured her. Changed the oil, kept the battery charged. I figured it might come in handy someday. If we can get it running, we can get around the barricades. Sarah looked at him, hope flickering in her eyes. You really think that could work? Mark shrugged, but his expression was determined. It's our best shot. We can't get to Becca's house on foot. The National Guard won't let anyone through. But with this, we might have a chance. If it runs, we can find Hope faster, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. We could get to Becca's house and see if they know anything. Exactly, Mark agreed, already reaching for his toolbox. We're running out of options and time is against us, but if we can get this truck started, we'll have a way out. Sarah exhaled, a sense of relief washing over her. Let's get to work then. We need all the help we can get. Mark gave her a reassuring nod. We'll make it happen one way or another. We're not giving up on Hope. We'll find her. Together they began working on the old Chevrolet, the urgency of their mission propelling them forward. Time was running out, but at least now they had a plan.